I want to thank Winslow Arts Trust and the Old Trails Museum at Homol'ovi State Park for hosting the exhibit. Please come and see it. If you haven't seen it yet, it's up for another year. It's a nice exhibit. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we learned during our field work at Homol'ovi. In case you don't know, the word Homol'ovi means mounded up in Hopi, or place of the buttes, which describes the area around which these villages are located outside of Winslow. And this is a map of the general area with Homol'ovi in blue over on the left side. And just to give you some idea that Homol'ovi isn't the only place that was occupied during this time. There are many neighbors that the people living at Homol'ovi interacted with, some more intensely than others. Those closest obviously were more involved in interactions, which would mean trade or even people moving in and out of areas and living in areas for time period. The main influence came from the Hopi Mesas 60 miles north. And for those of you who are not as familiar as some of you are about the Homol'ovi sites, there are 7 major sites, and they're listed on this map: Homol'ovi 1 through 4, Cottonwood Creek, Jackrabbit, and Chevelon. And they're all situated along the Little Colorado River because they were doing a lot of farming along the river, and there are many other resources for hunting and gathering that the river provides opportunities to as well. One time there were probably over 2,000 people living in these villages in the late 1300s. Talk about where these people came from and went to a little later on. This is a short history of work at Homol'ovi. I'm not going to read all of it. You can read it, but the villages were depopulated, people moving out around 1400. And the first field work done by archaeologists was in 1896 by a fellow named Fuchs, Jesse Walter Fuchs. He has not the best reputation among archaeologists today. He focused on burials and acquiring pots and other objects from burials, and many of those ended up in the Smithsonian Institution. There was further work done, a few concentrated, by the way, at Homol'ovi 1 and Chevelon. Further work was done in a little after Fuchs by the Field Museum at Chicago, and they also have a lot of their collections there, some on exhibit in both of these areas. A fellow named Sheriff Wathrin, for those of you who live in the Winslow area, probably know something about Sheriff Wathrin. He was an avid collector, and he sold his collections to the Field Museum in 1901. Then there was a long hiatus of kind of professional work until the Museum of Northern Arizona out of Flagstaff began working at Homol'ovi 1 and 2, and I was part of that project. I worked at M&A at the time and helped launch some of that field work at Homol'ovi 1 and 2. The work at M&A increased the seriousness of the vandalism that had been going on at the Homol'ovi sites for a long, long time, and was rapidly increasing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So additional studies were done at several of the other sites. And a lot of this was involved the beginning of cooperation and collaboration with the Hopi tribe, especially Stanley Honani, who was the vice chairman at the time and was instrumental in getting support, financial support for this work. As a result of the extra work that was being done in the late 70s and 80s, archaeologists, the Hopi tribe, people in Winslow, including the mayor at the time, Forest Service archaeologists, many approached the governor, Bruce Babbitt, who was a Flagstaff native, asking him to create a state park. And they were successful in getting this done through the legislature in 1986. And from 86 to 91, the park was headquarters was in the old Winslow Hubble building west of Main Street. And the current visitor center at the state park was built in 1991. Part of the renewed interest in the Homol'ovi area was the development of a proposal by Ray Thompson, who was the director of the State Museum at the U of A, and asked for funding from the legislature to create a research program at Homol'ovi. He was successful in getting this, and partly that was from the field work that had been done in the early 80s, proving that there was still areas worthy of research. I was hired in 1985 as part of this legislative budget package, and field work that we did is listed further down on the page. We worked at 6 of the 7 major Homol'ovi sites, as well as several other smaller ones, including the Pit House Village near the Visitor Center and a pueblo called Cresswell Pueblo. The 7 major Homol'ovi sites and then another one near Homol'ovi 1 are listed here in terms of their size. For those of you who aren't familiar with these or haven't visited them, you may be surprised at the size of, in particular, Homol'ovi 1 and 2, having over 1,000 rooms each. And then several others of the villages are much smaller, but Chevelon, which is kind of on the eastern end of the settlement cluster, has 500 rooms. Our excavations totaled fewer than 200 of the total of over 3,000 rooms. One of the challenges in working in such large communities is figuring out where to dig, because there's no way that you're going to have time to dig 1,200 rooms, and there's no point in it. You can learn a lot by just being careful in what areas you choose to work in. So we worked in Homol'ovi 1, 2, 3, 4, Chevelon, and Jackrabbit Pueblos, as well as the Adobe Pueblo. The things I want to focus on in terms of what we learned in our 30 years of field work at the Homol'ovi sites: how we built chronology, the importance of the regional environment in terms of the viability of living in the Homol'ovi villages, the creation of adobe bricks, which are quite common in some of the villages, and they're made out of forms, which I'll talk about. The existence of a lot of planning and engineering in these villages. They weren't just haphazardly thrown together as people moved in, but a lot of planning had to go into villages in order to accommodate people who were moving in. And then where did the people come from? I'll talk about the fact that there were very few to no people actually in the area when the big villages were settled. Our new understandings about the development and evolution of Kachina religion, feasting and things like that. And then some of the things we learned about structural fires, the burning of rooms in these villages and kivas. So one of the things that is really the most important things that archaeologists have to do, figure out the chronology of any place that they're working in. Sometimes this is fairly easy because there are a lot of things such as tree ring dating that can help tie specific dates to occupations. Homol'ovi tree ring dating doesn't work. There are 2 reasons for that. First one, that a lot of the wood that we found was too small. You have to have large beams for dating. A lot of it is cottonwood, and cottonwood, because it grows along the river, every ring looks like every other ring, so that's not useful for tree ring dating. And thirdly, a lot of the wood that they used was actually brought down by flood events, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the wood was brought in from trees that fell sometimes hundreds of years earlier than when they arrived at the area around Homol'ovi and were used for building structures. However, we can use what's called tree ring dated pottery, and that is pottery that is found at archaeological sites in the region around Homol'ovi that is tied into structures that are carefully dated through tree ring dating, so that we know when specific structures were occupied, what pottery was being used at that time. And because of that, we can assume that if we find that pottery at Homol'ovi, the dating that was worked out elsewhere will apply also to the pottery that we find at the Homol'ovi sites when we excavate. We also did a lot of seriation, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. That's based on attributes of almost anything, but we focus mostly on pottery. And then the importance of stratigraphy in terms of determining relationships between things. Things that are higher in a stratigraphic unit are known to be later than things that are lower in a stratigraphic unit profile, so we can at least relatively date things archaeologically. One of the things that is most important for our reconstruction of dating at the Homol'ovi sites is a pottery type that's called Jedido black on yellow. And here are some examples. Jedido black on yellow is actually made on the Hopi mesas and was traded down to Homol'ovi between about 1325 and 1400. And I'm not going to go into a lot about Jedido yellowware, except that it's yellow colored, very distinctive, and it has a narrow time frame based on tree ring dating of sites up at the Hopi that allows us to know that it was being made between 1325 and 1400 at the Homol'ovi sites. In our excavations at Homol'ovi 1 in particular, we found that the frequency of yellowware pottery as a percent of the decorated pottery in a stratigraphic unit increased the later in time we went, or the higher in the stratigraphic section we went. So in the low end of the stratigraphic section, which would be represented on the left side where my arrow is, yellowware pottery is, in this case, about 30%. At the upper end, it's close to 100%. And that's significant because we find this relationship consistently in the excavations we do at Homol'ovi 1. And this leads us to be able to use the percentage of yellowware that we find in the deposit as a way of dating through what we call seriation, the deposit that yellowware is in. So if we find a layer in a room and 80% of the decorated pottery in that layer is yellowware pottery, then we know it dates to the later part of the occupation of the site and the Homol'ovi villages in general. The other types of pottery are Winslow orangeware, which is what was being locally made at Homol'ovi. And then the other decorated wares, many of which are tree ring dated wares, which are very low frequency. So yellowware takes over by the mid 1300s in the Homol'ovi area. And this is a stratigraphic column of Chevlon, kiva Chevlon that we excavated in the early 2000s using the percentage of yellowware that we found in these different levels to be able to relatively date when these deposits were made. In this case, we know the kiva began to be filled about 1340 and continued to be filled up to past 1385. And this is based, again, purely on the percentage of yellowware that we find in these various levels. So this is how archaeologists build chronology when they don't have absolute dates that they can assign to things. They can use proxies such as yellowware percentage to create those dating tools. So seriation using Jedido yellowware. Another attribute of yellowware is where the banding line, that line that is at the top of the rim of the vessel, where it is located with respect to the rim of the vessel. So this is the banding line. And you can see in this middle one that it is some distance from the rim, and the ones above is closer to the rim, and the ones below is farther from the rim. Well, again, using the same methodology where we looked at rim sherds from different stratigraphic units in excavations associated also with a percentage of yellowware, we discovered that the banding line was systematically moved lower and lower and lower by Hopi potters through the period 1325 to past 1400, until by the mid 1400s, we see on the Hopi mesas, they stopped even painting banding lines. And this is just purely a function of the decoration in the bottom of the bowl being focused more and more on the bottom of the bowl and less on the sides of the bowl. So the earliest ones in 1325, the bowl is decorated considerably on the sides as well as the bottom. By the 1375 and 1400 period, the decoration is focused on the bottom and there's almost nothing on the sides except the banding line. So banding lines can be also used, a measurement of this distance, which is shown in the column on the right side here. The rim to the banding line increases from 5 millimeters up to 18 millimeters as we go through time. So we can use that measurement to determine just approximately where in an assemblage the pottery rims that we're finding dates. The other advantage to it is that we can go on the archaeological sites where we haven't done excavations and collect rim sherds and be able to date those archaeological sites on the basis of where the banding lines are. So that's enough about chronology. Now I want to talk about the environment, the regional environment. The map on the left side, and these are not the best maps in the world, but the map on the left side is where Homol'ovi 1 and 2 are located. This is the Mogollon Rim, and these are the different forested environments as we go from the rim, which in areas is around 7,000 or 8,000 feet, down to the elevation at Homol'ovi, which is 5,000 feet. And there are different plant communities in these, and I'll talk about those a little bit later on. And then this is Chevelon, Homol'ovi 1 and Homol'ovi 2 on the map on the right, and the Little Colorado River as it flows through it. So this entire region is drained by the Little Colorado River. And these are potential sources of wood where people could walk up into these areas, or the river could bring wood down to them through flood events. So this is where the role of the river is tremendously important to the people living at Homol'ovi. The river, Little Colorado River, is subject to annual flooding, which is associated with snowmelt in early April. Could be a little earlier now, but it could also be a little bit later. But whenever it is predictable. As the weather warms up, the water in the Little Colorado River will raise or increase the amount coming down. And this water can be used by the people living in the villages by damming up the river a little bit or catching the flood waters that are coming up over the banks of the river and diverting it into the floodplain. Another type of water flow into the Little Colorado River is from the monsoons or from heavy snowstorms in the winter and sometimes in January and February, there are warm systems that come up that melt the snow. In either of these cases, these large flood events, which occur typically in the mountains, much more heavily in the mountains, flow through the area in 1 to 2 days after the rains. This means that the farmers, the Homolubi farmers, are able to plan on surges of water coming into the floodplain and can capture this water, as I described earlier, floodwater capture, and can either capture it where it is, or they can take ditches and move that water even farther away from the river into floodplain areas. The other important thing that occurs with larger floods is that they can bring loads of soil and driftwood into the area, and gauges along the Little Colorado River in the last 100+ years have shown that one of these large floods occurs about once every 7 years. And so rather than having to travel to get wood, Homolubi people could use this supply of driftwood for roofing and fuel, which they did. So here is an image on the left side, what the Little Colorado River looks like. Typically, it's an average flow. You can see why it's called Little Colorado River. The area in red is the site of Homolubi 1. Those vehicles and things there are our vehicles. This was when we were excavating there in the late 1990s. And then the image on the lower right, as it indicates in the heading, is flooding that occurred in 1993. And I know I saw Karen is participating in this, and Chad, I'm sure they remember this very well. There were 2 floods, and one in January and one in February, and they partly covered the lower section of Homolubi 1 with floodwaters. The river was probably close to a mile wide. And this is an image of the driftwood pile that was left on the large South Plaza at Homolubi 1 in 1993. Now, the table on the right side indicates where, well, the bottom row is driftwood that we sampled from a pile a little ways away from Homolubi 1, and the source of where that wood came from as it was being carried down the river. So some of that wood came all the way from the subalpine areas of, say, the White Mountains. This would be spruce, for instance. Mountain conifer would be ponderosa pines, aspen, and things like that. The conifer woodland is pinyon and juniper, and the local riparian is cottonwood. And you can see that the numbers by the different sites are pieces that we collected in our excavations of pieces of wood. Even though we couldn't date it, we wanted to know where it was coming from or what type of wood it was. You can see in the very large Homolubi 1 and Homolubi 2 sites, there's a lot of this very large wood from a long way away. It's very unlikely that we're walking up there. It would be 50 miles in some cases, certainly 30 or 40 miles. So they were almost certainly getting this from driftwood piles. And you'll notice that Homolubi 3 and Homolubi 4, most of the wood is cottonwood. That's because when those people moved into the valley, there were still a lot of cottonwoods growing. These are the earliest sites dating to the late 1200s. By the time the major occupations of Homolubi 1 and Homolubi 2 took place, most of the cottonwood was gone, so they had to use driftwood for their construction. So fully a third of the wood from these sites is from the mountain conifer zone, and 16% is from the subalpine area. Another thing that we keep track of is our ability to date flood events. As I mentioned, there are gauges along the Little Colorado River, and they have recorded these flood events and the size of the events over the last 100 years. These are 70,000 cubic feet per second flood event, 50,000. These are big floods. The wood that we collected in the driftwood pile near Homol'ovi 1 had a lot of wood that we could actually tree ring date, because these were these big pieces of spruce, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, pinon, and things like that. So we were able to get dates from the driftwood, and I put together a chart suggesting what the driftwood might be associated with in terms of earlier floods that brought the driftwood part way down before it was carried all the way down in 1993. And a lot of the wood clusters, the dated wood, and could very well have been brought down by some of these earlier floods. And the correlation is just how many years it is between the last date in the driftwood date and when the flood event took place. So you can see that there's pretty close correlation to flood events and dates on driftwood piles or on pieces of driftwood. Another way that, and I'm going to bring this all together in a couple of slides. Another way that we can reconstruct high stream flow years is based on the size of tree rings. The width of a ring on a tree is related to how much water was available to that plant at the time it was growing. And dendrochronologists, people who study tree rings, are able to determine the likelihood of large amounts of water flowing down the Little Colorado River based on the width of the tree rings. And the Z-score, you don't have to really worry too much about that. This one means it's a small flood event, probably no driftwood associated. A medium flood event, which occurs, probably once every 25 to 50 years, might bring a little bit of driftwood down. But the large flood events, the 2.6 standard deviation is a 100-year flood event. The 3.3 is a 1,000-year event. And you can see on this right-hand column that there's in 1382 and 1384, there were two huge flood events. But also the numbers in red are small, medium, and large flood events that took place while the Homol'ovi villages were occupied. And so there was a great deal of minor flooding taking place in the early 1300s, a couple of medium-sized floods in the late 1200s, mid 1300s, and then the two large floods in the late 1300s. Those two large floods in the late 1300s might have been the beginning of the end of the occupation of the villages at Homol'ovi. So what I did then is I took the wood that we excavated from the various Homol'ovi sites, and we had about 20 pieces that we could actually get tree ring dates out of. And I tried to use those tree ring dates and compare it to when some of these flood events occurred in the past, and to try to determine when a major flood might have come through the Homol'ovi area. And the term regional means that they were probably fairly good sized flood events. And it looks like from the tree ring dates that we get in their clustering, two in particular, dating 1276, which is an actual date when that tree died, suggests that there were some major floods occurring in the late 1200s and early 1300s. Next, I want to talk about form molded adobes. Adobe occur earliest in the area around St. John's, which is 75 miles east of Homol'ovi. At Homol'ovi, they occur around 1300. And the ones at St. John's are hand molded. The ones at Homol'ovi are form molded. And we know they're form molded because they're uniform in width and height, although they vary in length. And they were probably using stone slabs to build these as forms to build the adobes. Adobes were probably being used because it's easier to control the size of the adobes. Also, stone had to be hauled from a fair distance away for sites like Homol'ovi 1. And having water and clay readily available makes it fairly easy to make adobes. And one of the things that is interesting about the use of form molded adobes at Homol'ovi is our discovery counter to what historians had believed really up to the time we began discovering adobes, which was that they thought the Spaniards introduced form molded adobes to Pueblo groups in the early 1600s when they settled in the area. And yet by 1300, we have hundreds of form molded adobe walled rooms being constructed at Homol'ovi. This area at Homol'ovi 1 is the area I'm talking about 300 rooms made out of form molded adobes. And these are some photographs. These are the adobes in a couple of walls. And this is a collapsed wall. We've cut it in profile so you can see the uniform side of the adobes. And then this is an adobe brick right here. And so, really important contribution to our understanding that form molded adobe bricks were actually commonly made in the Pueblo world going back a long way, and use of forms was probably began to be pretty common by the late 1200s or certainly 1300s. Examples of village planning, because Homol'ovi 2, the largest of the villages, as far as we can tell, based on the yellowware pottery frequency, was occupied for only about 35, 40 years. And yet it's a huge village. It was probably planned and built by groups moving into the area. The whole site was planned, and they used a technique called ladder construction. Other examples of village planning are raising the level of the South Plaza at Homol'ovi 1, the one that had adobe bricks, the design of the Great Plaza at Chevelon. These all required community planning. So some kind of centralized leadership was making decisions about construction events. So this is what's called ladder construction. The name comes from the fact that it kind of looks like a ladder. And what it is comprised of is the building of the outside walls first, all at once. They can be 20, 30, 100 feet long, and then subdividing the interior space, usually pretty evenly. So these walls are abutting or connecting to the exterior walls. This allows rapid construction because you can use a group of people to build the walls all at once. And then these are examples of ladder construction at Homol'ovi, the Homol'ovi villages, involving oftentimes 2-story rooms. This is a plan view of what it would look like, a double row of rooms versus a single row of ladder constructed rooms. So this allowed very fast construction, and is pretty common in very large villages in the Four Corners region in the beginning in the late 1200s. Here's Homol'ovi 2 to give you an idea how that ladder construction was put to use. 1,200 rooms, and most of these room blocks all the room blocks were built using some form of ladder construction, sometimes involving 20 or 30 rooms at a time, lengthwise. And just another view of Homol'ovi 2. Chevelon Pueblo, the planning of this huge plaza involved the construction by ladder construction, which is really obvious here, of these room blocks surrounding the plaza. So this plaza is 50 meters by 80 meters. It's several acres in size. And this is all part of a planned construction event to build the space and surround it by rooms, creating a plaza space. I'll get back to the red areas, which are the burned areas of the village. And then finally, Homol'ovi 1, the adobe brick part of the village. You see the 2M and 1M. That's meters, and that is the amount of dirt and sand that was hauled in, mostly from probably along the river, but it also involved dumping of trash by people in the community to raise the level of this area so that it didn't flood from the floodplain when the river flooded, or it didn't flood as frequently. So 2 meters is about 7 feet. 1 meter is 40 inches. So the total is 27,000 cubic feet of dirt that was brought in to raise this area in order to expand the community with the addition of these 300 rooms. Took a lot of planning and a lot of effort. And the trash that we find in this area suggests this happened about 1350. The villages, the early villages that we excavated, called Crestwell Pueblo and the Pit House Village near the state park, were on the basis of true ring dated pottery, were stopped being occupied around 1225 or thereabouts. The earliest large settlement, Homol'ovi, Homol'ovi 4, was founded about 1260. This means that there was as much as 35-year hiatus in occupation between people living where the park is today and the construction of the villages, which then means that everybody living in those villages came from somewhere else. These are the locations of Crestwell and the Pit House Village. This is Homol'ovi 1, Homol'ovi 2 in blue, and the floodplain of the Little Colorado going by. This is Crestwell Pueblo. It's actually made out of stone, and it is dominated by brownware pottery as its utility pottery. Brownware is made south of the Homol'ovi area. In contrast, we have a little pit house village, and that means people were living in pit structures, even into the 1100s and 1200s. And these people were using Little Colorado and Tucson grayware pottery. In other words, they were using pottery that was made to the north. So the Pueblo people were associated with groups to the south, the Pit House people with groups to the north. The structure circled is this structure, which might be a little kiva. It could be a house, but it's got holes in the floor that suggest there may have been weaving or something going on in the room. But of course, that could have also been done by a household. So where do we determine where people came from? It's by the way people make things that are what we would call habitual or unconscious, or of what you've been taught culturally. Many examples of this are pottery, what forms are used, its size, its finish, even the order of decoration, the form of kivas, how rooms were constructed and where features are on floors, and even how room blocks and plazas are constructed. So first of all, looking at pottery, to the left is what's called Jeto black on orange. This is pottery that was being made in the Hopi mesas between 1250 and about 1350. Below is Winslow orangeware, which is the local pottery being made at the Homol'ovi villages between about 1260 and 1350. Before and after yellow pottery began to be traded down to the Homol'ovi area And what I want to point out is that these are very, very similar. Similar in color, similar in layout, and similar in designs. And it was being made at the Hopi Mesas before it was being made in Homol'ovi as Winslow Orangeware. It's called Winslow Orangeware because they're making it on local clay and they're using local materials. But it's more than likely that people who are making Winslow Orangeware previously were making Jet black and orange and had migrated down to the Homol'ovi area. Another thing that we've discovered through dissertation by a graduate student, Claire Barker, that there are two different styles of corrugated pottery, utility pottery used for storage and cooking. The one on the left is parallel, and the one you can see it goes up and down, so they're parallel to each other, and the one on the right is oblique. And these are whole vessels. The oblique one is on the left and the parallel one is on the right. In our excavations and analysis of pottery, we found that 28% of the decorated pottery was the oblique style and 72% was the parallel style. The parallel style is the same style as corrugated pottery made on the Hopi Mesas at the same time. The oblique style is the same style as being made in the mountains in the areas to the south and east of Homol'ovi at the same time. So this suggests that there are two groups of people from different areas that are living and making pottery similar to what they were making at home before they moved to the Homol'ovi area. Another example is what we call Solano Polychromes, Roosevelt Redware. We find these at Chevron in particular, and they are being made at Chevron. They're identical in form and design to similar pottery being made in the White Mountains near what today is St. John's, Snowflake, and Sholo. And another thing that is important is Kiva's design. This is a Kiva at Homol'ovi, and you'll notice it's rectangular. It's got holes on the floor. This is where looms were set up. This is an example of what a loom would look like. And this was tied to the floor and then tied to the ceiling. This is a reconstruction of what one would look like at Homol'ovi. This is a one along the San Pedro near where I live in Tucson, also with the holes and rectangular. This style of kiva, there's another one, was being made at the Hopi Mesas at the same time. Rooms, this is a typical room made out of stone at Homol'ovi. They're small because the wood source for building roofs on them is a limited supply and small roofing materials. The layout of the villages is very similar to what we see in the region, especially up at Hopi. So I've already given away the answer, but the traits that we see suggest that, using the percentage of parallel corrugations, that maybe 3/4 of the people living at the Homol'ovi villages in, say, the 1300s probably migrated down from the Hopi Mesa villages that were occupied at the same time. However, 1/4 of them, with the use of adobe bricks, which is associated with the East as well as the oblique pottery design, up to 1/4 of them might have been groups who came from the East or the Southeast. And this is an example of where groups of people might have come from the arrows. The thicker arrow indicates the higher percentage of people who probably ended up living in the Middle Little Colorado River area. Kachina Religion appears in the form of rock art, pottery, and kiva murals. And it's associated with the size of villages and the layout changes in villages, especially the addition of large plazas. We also see changes in feasting. The clearest example of the likelihood that Kachina religion was at Homol'ovi are the appearance of Kachina faces on yellow pottery that's being traded down from the Hopi area. Another example are petroglyphs near Homol'ovi 2 of Kachina faces. Also, a really important kiva at Homol'ovi 2, which depicts the San Francisco peaks, which for the Hopi today is the home where Kachinas live and come from when they come and visit the Hopi area starting in the winter and spring. And then here is a Hopi elder visiting that mural and confirming that it is the San Francisco peaks being depicted. At the same time that we see these Kachina images showing up, we see the construction of large plaza spaces at Homol'ovi 2 and the addition of them at Homol'ovi 1 and the construction of that big one at Chevron. And my guess is that that is partly because they're beginning to have performances of Kachina ceremonies, perhaps something like this, where individuals are sitting in those room blocks, those stepped rooms, and observing performances of Kachinas. So there's strong indication in the Homol'ovi villages, Kachina ceremonies probably being introduced from the Hopi area became very important in the communities after 1365 or so. Associated with the appearance of Kachina religion are changes in the way food was cooked. The best example is the appearance of piki. One of the important aspects of Kachina religion and all ceremonies in Pueblo society is that there's feasting or there's a lot of food that's brought out and shared with people. This is where women are an important part of these ceremonies. And of development or the increased importance of something such as piki, which is very common in Hopi villages today, we see the appearance of piki stones showing up in the earliest of the villages at Homol'ovi, which is Homol'ovi 4. We have one example of a ceramic cooking stone, which is komal, and these were probably initially used to cook tortillas and then later used to cook piki. We also see the appearance of really large pottery, which is probably associated with cooking for large groups of people. And we identified a women's ritual precinct in the northeast corner of the big plaza at Homol'ovi 1, the one made out of adobe bricks. You may not be able to read it, but this is a mealing room here, another mealing room here. That's where corn was ground by using several bins. And then this is where that piki stone was found. So this area was being heavily used by women for preparing corn and cooking corn for ceremonies. This is a piki stone that we found at that Homol'ovi 1 next to that room that I just showed you. You can see the circular outline of what may have been tortillas that were initially made on these stones, but later on they were converted to the making of piki, which is shown here in a painting of the late 1800s, showing a Hopi woman making piki on one of these stones. This is what piki looks like today. It's usually blue, made out of blue corn, with ash added to it to give it a really deep blue color. Finally, structural fire. We see at Homol'ovi, at Chevron, that much of the village was burned when people left. And we can see stores of corn were burned. Here are two examples. Melanie Medieros, who's sitting in on this, excavated this room and found this corn. And the walls of this structure and the heat used to burn this, and the advice and the counsel of a couple of arson investigators from the FBI that were consultants on this, indicated that this fire in these rooms would have been close to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To get an idea of how burning worked, we did some experiments, and if you've been to the state park, you know that the structures that we built in the early 2000s using high school students were experimental rooms for setting the roofs on fire using rooms that are identical to the ones at Chevron to get an idea of just how roofs burn, how they collapse, and how the roofs might spread. And we were able, on the basis of the experimental rooms, to design ways to collect information about, from the wood that we found and the logs that we found, about just how fire starts and moves through a room. And this is an example of a room where we did excavations and were able to reconstruct how, using the knowledge of our FBI consultants, how the fire in this structure moved through the roof based on the amount of burning in the roof, whether it went all the way through or only partly through or not at all. And on the basis of the ash, the sooting on the wall as it goes up, and the sooting typically rises up to the point where a fire was started. So on the basis of that, we were able to reconstruct where these two rooms adjacent to each other at Chevron, where the fire probably started and spread. And this is what the floor of one of those rooms looked like. It's orange because the fire was so hot, it turned the brown soil, oxidized it. So what we learned from our experiments and excavations, that fires were purposely set by occupants. As far as we can tell, all no longer occupied were burned at the same times. That this is the last act at Chevron, and it was likely to close or terminate the occupation of the village. And that the intent was to close the village so that people would not reuse it or reoccupy it ever again. And as with other Homol'ovi cluster sites, they moved to the Hopi villages around 1400. And so this is where we think residents moved to when they left Chevron. Vast majority, 90% or so, moved to Hopi. A few may have ended up at Zuni based on their roots in the brownware tradition. So this is just a discussion about our involvement with the Hopi in terms of the important role they've played in helping us do our work, our research, and our exhibit that we did at Arizona State Museum, and that is now in the building, Winslow Arts Trust building next to the La Posada. We gotten some grants specifically to increase Native student participation in archaeological research. And I want to thank again the Winslow Arts Trust for hosting the exhibit, and all these people and foundations and for supporting the work that we've done at Homol'ovi. And thank you all.